This is Chris Casey, Managing Director at WindRock Wealth Management. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Jeff Deist, President of the Mises Institute and well-known writer and speaker. Previously, he worked as a longtime advisor and chief of staff to Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul. So Mr. Deist has some great knowledge and insight on politics and elections. Mr. Deist, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Chris Casey, it's great to hear from you.
Hey, let's talk about the status of the election. The mainstream media reports that Trump is way behind in the polls, and more importantly, he appears to be way behind in key states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, even Florida. Can the polls be trusted? And how do you look at the polls, and what are they telling you?
No, I don't think they can be trusted for a couple of reasons. First, I would add as an aside, he is at or above where he was polling against Hillary Clinton at this point 4 years ago. So we have to take all of this with a grain of salt for starters. But so two things have radically changed with respect to polling. And there's a lot of people out there like Frank Luntz, for example, who made a huge amount of money as a pollster and providing information to the parties. And so a whole ecosystem developed around polling. And this, everyone thinks that elections are won by data and manipulating and understanding the data and using that data to target a particular message to particular parts of the country and cities and all that. In other words, unlike 50 years ago, we don't just have sort of one general message, but now we have to tailor it. Young people want to hear this, black voters want to hear this, that sort of thing. So that's this big emphasis on data. The tech companies have gotten into the game as well. So there's money to be made in polling. But the problems are twofold. First is that in an era where lots and lots of people don't have a landline phone and only have a cell phone, a mobile phone, which they often change when they switch providers or they move, or if they're younger, they have a bunch of roommates and they're sort of bouncing around a lot more than old-fashioned single-family households. The ability to reach people is much impaired. It's not like how it used to be even 30 years ago when people stayed in an address, let's say, for longer and had a landline phone. So landline phones were really the linchpin of polling, and those are, going away quickly. The second thing is that before the Trump era so much, and before this great divide we find ourselves in the United States, people were more honest with pollsters, and now they tend to lie more. It's a strange phenomenon. Presumably you're anonymous in a poll. You're never going to see the pollster again or speak to him or her on the phone again. But nonetheless, there's this weird social environment now where people don't want to own up to supporting Trump, or don't want to say they're voting for him, or don't want other people to think that they're voting for him. And for the moment anyway, we wonder how pure this is. But for the moment, voting is still an anonymous function. So supposedly nobody knows how you voted. So those are the two things that make polls really unreliable today. And I have no idea if Trump's ahead or behind, honestly. But what I do know is that if you look at the 6 swing states that he took from Obama, that he switched, the margins in those states were very small. I mean, fewer than 200,000 votes scattered amongst those swing states would have cost him the electoral college victory. So that's a pretty thin margin. And what it means is that he doesn't have a lot of votes to give away. He has to win those states as he did in 16 and at least by the same margins. Now, I don't think there's any scenario where he handily gains a bunch of popular votes and wins both the popular vote and the electoral college vote. That's probably a stretch given the way that our country is, given the red state, blue state thing. But, is it possible that he's actually gained in a few of those states? He may have gained in Florida. Ohio, he won by a pretty big percentage. Has he lost all of that? I think he won it by 10 or 12 points. Same with Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. The other question, Chris, is whether he could potentially picked up any state that he didn't win in 16. People are sort of sleeping on that as well. So I would say this is a crapshoot, and rather than listening to pollsters, I would go to a site like PredictIt, where people are putting their own cash on the line, and that's where I think the action is.
It makes a lot of sense. Look, if we just took the polls though at their face value, and let's just say he is lagging right now, Trump's lagging, Why would you think that is? Is it the state of the economy? Is it anything he's done this year, or inaction or action? Or is it something earlier? Like, did he not fulfill any particular campaign promises? What do you think is the biggest detriment to his campaign right now?
Well, I think he deserves to be lagging. I'm surprised he isn't lagging more. And none of this is his fault per se, but you've got a country reeling from COVID lockdowns. Some people say that second quarter 2020 GDP is down as much as 36% over 2019. We've got millions of people sitting at home idly, getting a check from government in the form of an enhanced federal unemployment benefit. You've got restaurants shut down. You've got no travel. You've got people dining out less, people buying less gas. I mean, you have an absolute economic debacle. And on top of that, you have major cities in the United States experiencing huge riots, whether that's at the hands of Black Lives Matter protesters or Antifa or whatever it may be. So, I mean, if you just look at that, you say the state of the country is terrible. And of course, you would imagine that the incumbent's going to lose. Now, I don't think most Americans blame him for COVID or even the response. I mean, frankly, his response has, despite all the bluster, has been about what it ought to be, which is that it's a state and local matter and that it ought to be up to governors. I happen to agree with that perspective. And as far as the riots and protests, I mean, a lot of this anger, left versus right, was baked into the cake before he was ever president. A lot of this anger at police and over what I think is a wildly overblown view of racism in America. That's, again, my opinion. All that predates Trump. He's just a lightning rod for it. So honestly, when you look at it, you look at the situation in America, the fact that he's even in this is pretty remarkable. And I think the reason he's in it is because there is kind of this remnant of what people back in the Nixon era used to call the silent majority, people who look at what's happening in Portland or Seattle or even Chicago and say, wow, I may not like Trump so much, but I'm against that. And, people want to get back to normal. They want to stop wearing masks. They want to go back to work. They want to deal with this thing like a virus that is, by all appearances, if you're under about age 50, no more lethal than ordinary influenza. So I think he is viewed politically as the as the candidate who wants to get back to work, who wants to end the lockdown. So it's a strange time, but the fact that he could win with all the economic turmoil in this country is remarkable. I mean, that would be as remarkable as him winning in 2016.
Now, let's say you were given that. Let's say you're Trump's campaign manager. What would you be suggesting he does right now? Is it just accentuating some of those issues, or is there anything else you could think of?
Well, unfortunately, he hasn't done a lot of things he was elected to do by his supporters. He hasn't really drained the swamp. He hasn't really done anything about the political class and how it wears on us. He hasn't been terrible on foreign policy. I wouldn't say that he has extended our reach overseas, but he hasn't much reduced it either. And maybe most of all, he hasn't been that sort of bodyguard that he was hired to be. I mean, against the worst excesses of the left. If anything, we're seeing the left is emboldened, and all of those things like cancel culture and intense anti-racism in corporate America, intense anti-racism in academia, all of these things that make a lot of kind of middle American Christians nervous. Those things have actually gotten worse. So I think that's a big part of his problem, is that he is unfocused. He's very good at Twitter, and he's pretty good on his feet at those press conferences, but he doesn't seem to have a detail-oriented mind. He doesn't seem to be able to stick to it on particular issues or focus. And so if I were him, given the limited time, I guess it's fewer than 90 days left, I would be focused intensely on the economy and saying, we need to get back to work. We need to stop treating COVID as an existential threat like a world war or something. It isn't that. And I would stick with, saying we ought to be back in school, we ought to be playing football. And then I think he could still strike a blow or two against the Democratic ticket by announcing some new reductions or pullouts of the Middle East, which is still popular. I mean, nobody wants to be in these endless wars in the Middle East. There's no constituency for these outside of Washington, D.C. And then finally, he ought to take advantage in a crass political way of these riots and protests. I mean, at some point, the American people are going to suffer fatigue and say, come on, you're not protesting because of racism or because George Floyd was killed. You can't, it's 60, 70 days since those events, and you're still, burning down some poor Starbucks somewhere. I mean, this isn't doing anybody any good, and property destruction, all that, it ought to make people nervous. So to the extent in the 11th hour that he could still pull out sort of some semblance of an image that he's the law and order president versus the rioting and looting president, I mean, that seems like a pretty straightforward play.
Well, let's flip that last question around and look at what Biden can do to lose the campaign. So the biggest risk, I think everyone agrees, is that any dementia that he may have or loss of cognitive prowess is going to be just too pronounced for the average voter to ignore if it's on display. So do you agree with that? And if so, do you even think that they'll risk having a debate? I mean, it would be unheard of, but could they just simply cancel the debates?
Yeah, they probably should. First of all, having a digital online convention spared the Democrats having to worry about riots or protests from the left in a physical location in a city. So that was probably wise. They don't want a bunch of Antifa showing up and demanding Bernie become president or something. So that's going to work to their favor. And you don't want to have Joe Biden on stage for an hour or two. Trump can do it. I mean, if you look at some of these campaign rallies, he's saying a lot of things that are just sort of off the cuff stream of consciousness. But nonetheless, I mean, Trump certainly has the endurance to go up there and speak on his feet for an hour or two. This is not a problem for him, and it's clearly a problem for Biden. So they have to hide that. And also they have to wonder about, I think we know who Joe Biden is. He may be deteriorating, but we still know who he is. He was never an intellectual superstar. He was never someone with a strongly held set of beliefs or principles. He was always just kind of that senator from a really corporate beholden state, by the way, Delaware. And, he's kind of a known quantity. I mean, he was vice president for 8 years. But this election is really more about what comes next. And I think they now think Kamala Harris comes next, and that Trump is so bad that they're willing to accept this placeholder old white guy who's not as left wing as they would like him to be, but they're willing to take that just to get rid of Trump. And also with the expectation that Biden may not make it 4 years, much less 8 in the office. So they've got a real opportunity here to make this election more about Harris and less about Biden. So if I were them, I would be keeping Biden away from the camera and keeping him in his role, as his hilarious role from my perspective, as some sort of elder statesman, and let her be out there. And so I think that they probably imagine they can just run out the clock, that as long as they don't have any big gaffes between now and then, that people are going to be upset enough with Donald Trump and the state of the economy and the state of COVID and the state of riots and unrest to just say, well, we got it. We can't keep going this way. So that would be the smart way to go about it. But they can't control Trump. That's just it. This is what they still haven't come to terms with, which is just this guy is relentless. I mean, I can't tell you how many times since he was elected, or even during his campaign, where I sort of got a sense of, wow, he's really done it now. I mean, now he's going to finally peak, and from now on, he's going to be this deeply unpopular guy because, he had a bad 48 hours or 72 hours or something like that. And every time he just comes back. I mean, the guy shows you the value in life of just sheer tenacity and bluster. I mean, sometimes if you just have an unshakable sort of self-belief or self-image, that'll take you a long way. I mean, there's something to be said for that, whether you love him or hate him. But they can't control him, and that's the big crapshoot in this election but what happens between now and then that moves the needle. I think the Democrats are hoping that nothing happens, that they just kind of bleed out the clock in this slow play and keep COVID front and center. They don't want people going back to school. They don't want football. They don't want life to begin to appear normal again.
Jeff, I know you got rid of Netflix, but did you happen to watch the American version of House of Cards?
I have seen some seasons of that with Kevin Spacey and with I've forgotten her first name, Penn, as the first lady. So I've seen a few seasons.
Well, so for those that don't know, it's a political show where Kevin Spacey's president, very, very dishonorable man as president. And one of the things, one of the episodes, they had an election. And he was able to manipulate the election by closing polling stations in key states early with the so-called threat of terrorism, which was purely made up. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but we have a potential mail issue here with a lot of people mailing in their votes. We do have the pandemic still existing, which they may potentially close things early, or maybe there is a threat of a terrorist attack at polling stations, etc. Do you see any way, whether it's that or something else, where the election could be contested? And what would that look like in your eyes?
Yeah, I think it's at least 50% chance. We could have an election week or an election month. We could have a situation like 2000 when we didn't sort of know who was ostensibly president until the Supreme Court decided. Because here's the thing, again, I don't think Trump is going to add 6 million votes, let's say, to his 2016 total and comfortably win both the popular vote and the Electoral College to the point where the left would have to just look at the optics and say, oh, geez, we better just concede. That's very unlikely because depending on who you want to believe, I'm not so sure about this, but supposedly Hillary Clinton got about 3 million votes total. Now, if we had a popular election process, maybe Trump would have campaigned more in New York, his home state, and gotten a few million more votes there. Maybe he would have spent some time in California, which he completely ignored, sensibly, understanding that the Electoral College would go to Hillary no matter how much time he spent out there. So, would he have spent a little more time in California or Texas or, picked up a few million more votes? So we can't just say that if Hillary won the popular vote and that was that. I mean, he played the game as it was laid out, and he actually won, although by narrow margins in some of the states. The ultimate Electoral College vote total was a pretty robust victory, all things considered. So let's not forget that. But here's the thing: let's say he narrowly wins the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. Or let's say a few of those deciding Electoral College states are up in arms and not decided the morning after the election. Let's see a couple of states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, important swing states in the college. And you've got both sides howling about fraud or disenfranchisement, or the left saying that the mail-in ballots weren't counted, the right saying that mail-in ballots are illegitimate. I mean, look, you could easily see some postal employee, who's probably a contractor, not even an employee of the federal government, just taking a bunch of votes from a Republican fancy suburb somewhere and dumping them in a sewer. I mean, is that really? I mean, do we really think that's not going to happen? I mean, does anybody trust mailing this thing in? I certainly don't. But something like that happens where the next day you've got all kinds of fighting, legal challenges in certain states. I mean, that could go on for weeks or months. And then you could have Trump digging in and saying, I'm still the president and I won, and so I'm going to stay president come January. And the left saying that's a coup. Or you could have it the other way around, where Biden is saying that he won and he intends to take office. And, I mean, there's a lot of permutations here that could be very ugly for this country. And then I think you're going to see real riots and real protests, because the left is not going to just sit there idly and let this guy be reinstalled. I mean, even if he wins fair and square, I mean, they're going to basically say that white people who voted for Trump are trying to kill them, that they voted for a racist, white supremacist, TV celebrity star who is totally unfit for office, who is a fascist, and who, his reelection just shows that the American red states are totally irredeemable. And, the left's going to go to war. They're going to go to at least metaphorical war over that. They're not going to just say, well, we lost, 4 more years of Trump, then we'll try again. No way. Things have become too fractured in this country. There's no way that Trump just sort of, easily wins and is, inaugurated anew in January. I cannot see that. So if Biden manages to win comfortably both electoral college and popular vote, then, that may be the most peaceable transition. But I mean, let's not forget the whole idea behind democracy, mass democratic voting, which I would argue has not produced liberalism in the West. It's actually produced illiberalism. The whole point behind it was the peaceful transfer of political power. And if it's no longer yielding that, then what are we even doing? I mean, so I'm very concerned about it. I don't like it. I think the economy is weak enough that we don't need more political unrest. I'm sick of politics. I'm sick of political divisions, the politicization of everything. All of that makes me very, very tired. And it destroys economics. Economics is just another word for social cooperation. And in economics, we have win-win. In politics, we have win-lose. In politics, we have a fixed pie. In economics, we have a pie that we can grow. So the more our society revolves around politics and the less around economics, that makes me very worried about my kids and their future, because we're going to get a lot poorer and a lot nastier if we allow this to continue. So, I don't know how it's going to play out, but I don't see it playing out peaceably unless there's a clear Biden victory.
I totally agree with that. The stock market seems oblivious to that scenario. But let's say Biden does win, and maybe he makes gains in the Senate. Democrats make gains in the Senate, or even retake it. How radical do you think their agenda may be? Because politicians are always seem more extreme when they're candidates than when they're actual office holders. But I'm not sure who's really calling the shots in like a Biden administration. Like, what should we expect? Is it a Green New Deal? Is it we effectively already have a modern monetary theory, the unlimited printing of dollars? What should we expect under a Biden administration?
Well, I think, ironically, unlike, let's say, a Bill Clinton, who was a very canny politician, Biden hasn't really had to move to the left in his campaign, because the primary shook out very strangely with Bernie finally conceding and Elizabeth Warren dropping out. And so I think Biden might be one of those instances where he actually governs left of how he ran. So that bothers me. And I think there's going to be a call for a mandate, especially if the Dems retake the Senate. They're going to say, look, this election was a repudiation of Trump and everything he stands for. And I think you will see over 4 years, you'll basically see a new Reconstruction in so many words. In other words, the left will seek to punish the red states for the audacity of ever installing Trump. So not only did we lose 4 years of progress that we would have gained under Hillary Clinton, this progressive arc to history, which they believe in, but we actually went backwards under Trump. And I think there's going to be a degree of vengeance, and that is going to manifest itself in policies directed at harming red states, directed at harming sort of blue-collar white constituencies. And I think this is going to be sort of a purge, a never again type thing. Like America had its big fascist flirtation, and we need to make sure that never comes back. And one way we make sure it never comes back is to punish and politically vanquish the people who made it possible. I think that is entirely in line with the rhetoric and beliefs of today's left in America. I think that's what they'll try to do. And so I think if Biden wins, the right will be in a position where, the red states will be in a position where they have to, view themselves as in the wilderness, and they have to sort of coalesce around state and local governance and say we are going to do everything in our power here to, not be under the federal thumb in our own state. You mentioned that we're basically, at least in part, funding federal government right now using MMT. So that's an interesting thing. If we can basically fund half or more of the fiscal year 2020 federal operations using debt, then why couldn't it be 80%? Why couldn't it be 90%? I mean, if you believe in this stuff, I mean, you and I might argue that ultimately this will have very serious and bad ramifications for the US dollar down the road. But in the short term, a lot of people on the left believe in monetary theory that government can simply print up the money. It needs, whether that's literally to just print it and put it into the economy, or print it and buy treasury debt, which is basically what the Fed does now. If we can fund so much of the federal government, I think that's an opening for red states and red state governors to say, what if we were more like Switzerland, where we have these deep divisions between the red and blue states? What if 80% of your taxes went to your state and only 20% to the federal government, and far more was decided at the state and local level? I mean, I think that's the only path open to those red states going forward. Now, the left is going to resist that. They're going to say, no. You don't get to go away on your own because you're a sore loser. Now is the time for you to take your punishment. Your punishment comes from Washington, D.C. But you don't get to decide your own, to make your own decisions about the Second Amendment or abortion or taxes or anything else. But, there's an opportunity here for people to start viewing their state as the central organizing government in their life, and if Trump somehow manages to win, you better believe the left is going to go crazy with this. You are going to have federal nullification like you've never seen before in states like Washington and Oregon and California and Massachusetts. I mean, they're not going to want to listen to Trump. They're going to strike out on their own. They're going to, and there's a lot of de facto secession happening right now. People are leaving places like New York and New Jersey. People are leaving places like California, because of a variety of things, because of the COVID shutdowns, because of the civil unrest, because of housing issues. I mean, this is a big exodus, probably the biggest we've seen since maybe the 30s Dust Bowl in this country. And that has a lot of interesting ramifications for states' rights, for a more decentralized approach. So I hope that the left understands that a civil war is unthinkable. It's undesirable. Doesn't even begin to. I mean, it would be such a mistake, and that there are a lot more deplorables than they think out there, and they are, they're not dying off as fast as they think, and that it's actually in their interest to allow, if Biden wins, a much stronger degree of federalism amongst the states. I mean, I think a lot of our problems stem from the fact that we view Washington, D.C., and sometimes just 5 people on the Supreme Court, not even the legislature, as the ultimate arbiter of the economic and social policies under which we're forced to live. And that's a huge mistake. That's a recipe for anything but social cohesion. So I put a lot of faith in sort of a decentralist revolution that's taking place technologically and otherwise around the world. And it was really gaining steam prior to COVID. I fear COVID may have a centralizing effect in that a lot of big companies like Amazon and Walmart and Google will survive and even thrive during them, whereas a lot of the upstart competition will be harmed. But I put my faith more and more in the idea of separation rather than persuasion. I think people are pretty dug in, and I don't think either party is doing much in terms of persuasion. I think what the parties are relying on at this point is both sides saying, well, I'm not with them. It's a very tribal effect. So I'm optimistic about the concept of America becoming a more federal system, more like Switzerland, less governed by Washington, D.C., especially if they don't need our taxes, which apparently they don't. So that's where I place my optimism, Chris.
Well, it's nice to hear a silver lining in all that. Your description of a new Reconstruction. I don't know if you've used that or written about that somewhere else. I think it's completely on point. A couple different ways they could punish the red states. One is that they could make DC and Puerto Rico states to move the majority in their favor. Another is they could change the electoral process, do away with the electoral college, move to a popular vote. And those both obviously require constitutional amendments, which may be a little more difficult. But the one thing they probably could do, I was thinking, is they could probably pack the Supreme Court. And although Roosevelt tried it, and I'm not even sure why there was such pushback against him, because he had a huge victory in 36 when he tried doing this in 37. But I don't think they would view it the same way. I think wouldn't Democrats be on board with packing the court, because they view it as the last bastion of the Republican right. There's people on it that they feel should never have been put on it in the first place. Wouldn't they feel that this was justice to actually pack the Supreme Court?
Well, of course they would, and more importantly, they're better at politics than the right. They understand this is about winning. This is about imposing and harming. It's not about process. How many conservatives are still like, oh, well, the Constitution's electoral college, they don't care about any of this. I mean, I'm not saying the right has shown some great degree of fealty to the Constitution. I mean, we might as well be talking about the Magna Carta. I mean, something 250 years ago now might as well be 2,000 years ago. So I think they absolutely would try that. They'd be smart to try that. They could probably get it through. And they're about winning. I mean, the left is serious. That's what the right doesn't understand. The right is mostly just kidding. When politicians on the right say, I want to ban abortion, or I want to get rid of the income tax, or I want to get rid of the Department of Energy, they don't really mean it. They just say that to get elected. When the left said 30 years ago, we're going to have gay marriage in this country, or whatever, they meant it, and they got it. And they don't care whether that comes through a legislature. They don't care if that comes with or without popular support. They don't care if it's done by a court. They don't care if it's done by an executive order. They just care that it's done. And then once it's done, it becomes part of the landscape. And now it's unthinkable that we would ever not have gay same-sex marriage in the United States, right? I mean, so that's how you win things politically. And it never required a majority. I mean, that's the thing. That's how politics works. So I think the Supreme Court is an absolute linchpin. The left understands that the Supreme Court matters a hell of a lot more than Congress or the Senate. I mean, come on, way more. The House of the Senate. Look at what John Roberts did with Obamacare. I mean, look, come on. This is where the action is. So if demographic trends continue, and the Democrats can begin to win Texas and Florida in national elections, then they can just drop their fuss about the electoral college, because it won't matter. I mean, once that happens, once Texas and Florida are blue, the Republicans will never win a national election again, and they will become a permanent minority party, and hopefully maybe a more strategic party at the state and local level, which will be their new role. That might actually be a good thing, because they'll just be a left and right wing of the Democratic Party. Right. There's always going to be a left and right, even if you just have the Democrats sweeping everything. I mean, that's what people forget. They act like somehow there isn't sort of a left and right already in the Democratic Party. So the idea that all of a sudden we'd be so much worse off, I'm not sure. But the electoral college may not matter that much longer. Now, if all these people fleeing to Texas and Florida from blue states actually come to those states and add to the red totals, now that'll be very interesting. But up until COVID and this latest exodus, I think we all are mostly assumed that Texas and Florida were going to inexorably become blue states via immigration, both foreign immigration, but also domestic migration. I don't know. Maybe that's changed. Maybe all the people moving to Florida now from New Jersey are mad at taxes and mad at property restrictions and mad at masks and losing restaurants and all that sort of thing. But I don't know. I don't think Democrats just become Republicans overnight so easily. So it's going to be interesting. But the Supreme Court is far more powerful than Congress. I mean, that's really the de facto lawmaking body for the United States. And I don't know why President Biden wouldn't try to add 5 people to it, especially if they win the Senate. I mean, that would be a no-brainer. And one thing the left is really good at is, throwing out an outrageous trial balloon so that the fallback position seems reasonable. You throw out, like, we're going to add 5 Supreme Court justices. So then when you just add 2, all of a sudden people are like, well, that's I guess I can live with that. And if you look at states like California, which is about to institute a new wealth tax, which applies to people, I believe, with over a $30 million net worth. Now, even in California, that's a 1% proposition, but that number will come down over time. And they're even attempting to apply it for 10 years after you leave, although it ratchets down supposedly during that 10 years. Now, this hasn't been passed yet, but it's contemplated. And California is a good biosphere to examine because they have a Democratic progressive governor, and they have Democratic progressive supermajorities in both their state House and Assembly, or their state Senate and their state Assembly, both bodies. So they can override any governor's veto. They have a 2/3 majority. By they, I mean sort of deep left progressives. So California now, from a procedural standpoint, has no mechanisms to stop any sort of tax increase or things that just 10 years ago they still had, because there were more than a third of the legislature was still Republicans who would vote against getting rid of, like, their infamous Prop 13 out there, which restricts property taxes statewide. So those kinds of barriers, procedural barriers, are now gone. So California is going to do what it wants to do. It may be up against reality here, because an awful lot of people realize they can go live in Reno, 3 hours away, and have no income tax, that sort of thing. Or go live in Phoenix and buy a house for $280,000 instead of $980,000. But I think California is where you have to look. That what's happening in Sacramento is what might happen in D.C. if you get to kind of a uniparty Democratic control of the federal government. That would be the example. So all of this is furthered by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court helps the left create its great leaps forward. And I haven't heard Biden or Kamala Harris talk about it, but if they win, and they win pretty handily, I think that might be one of the first things you hear from the Democratic base is just howling about Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and let's get on it.
I see what you mean by a single party in charge. We're going to be down to, the left and right will become the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. You mentioned the demographic trends as far as against the Republicans in key states, and just overall. And most people probably don't realize, but post-Reagan, we've had 8 elections, and they've been split. Although the Democrats have won the popular vote in 6 of 8, which is fairly significant. So given that, and given the demographic trends you mentioned, do you think Trump's the last Republican president?
Well, the demographics have shifted suddenly under our feet with respect to COVID. So before COVID, I would have said yes to that question right away. Now I got to hedge it. I know no one wants to hear a hedge, but because a lot of Mexican immigration has just cut off. And, I'll take Mexican immigrants all day long. I think they're, an absolute bonus to America. I wish we could trade progressives for Mexicans. You're not supposed to say things like that, but, but they do vote overwhelmingly Democrat once they're able to vote. Asian American immigrants voted 70% for Obama. People don't necessarily get that, but they do. Black Americans voted 90+% for Obama. They voted about 88% for Hillary Clinton. So, all Biden has to do is get 85, 88% along Hillary Clinton lines, and the black vote is still entirely captured by the Democrats. So It's still probably long term. The country is going to become more Hispanic, but this COVID thing, if it lingers, and especially if it lingers in people's consciousness, not so much the reality of how lethal and how viral COVID really is, which I think we've been oversold. But if it stays in people's minds, it's a matter of perception that we're living in this new era of pandemics. We're already seeing people say that international travel is going to be a fraction of what it was. And, that could also apply to international migration. I mean, for all these left-wing Schengen and area countries in Europe, for example, the first thing they did during COVID was close their borders, not just to people from China or Africa or something, but I mean to other Europeans. Like a Frenchman can't go into Germany. So, they've been talking about this, the United States of Europe for a long time, but they sure threw that out the window at the first sign of trouble. And so the Canadians sealed their border. I mean, Trudeau, the great humanitarian, immediately shut down flights and you can't even Americans. You and I can't go to Toronto tomorrow. I believe that is still the case.
It is
either driving or flying. I mean, that's pretty crazy. I mean, we're talking America and Canada. We're not talking, Israel and Jordan or something. So, I mean, this is pretty remarkable. And so we may, at least for a period, have a less globalist world and a more nationalist world. And that's got good and bad to it. So that's the caveat as to whether we could have another Republican. But if you're all excited about that, if you lean right or something, I wouldn't be too excited, because that Republican is just going to be someone in the form of a Nikki Haley or something. I mean, it's just going to be someone who espouses what Democrats espoused 20 years ago or something. So I don't put a lot of faith in these people. I had hopes for Trump as a greater disruptor than he has managed to be. That was always the promise of Trump, but I have no faith in these Republicans. But look, there's something to be said for slowing the pace. The left is good at incrementalism, but right now it feels like they're galloping. And if a Trump or even a Nikki Haley slows them down a little bit, there's something to be said for that in terms of buying some more time.
Well, Jeff, how can people listen to more of your speeches and podcasts or read your work? What's the best way to do that?
Well, it can always visit Mises.org, but I think it's easier just to follow the Mises Institute on Twitter, or follow me, Jeff Deist, all one word, on Twitter. Always appreciate it. And I do a weekly podcast, which is pretty techy. It's book heavy. We go through actual substantive econ. It's called the Human Action Podcast. So it's not for everybody. We fully admit it is a bit of an acquired taste. But if you like Mises and Rothbard and Hayek and Hoppe, and you actually like getting into those kinds of books, we always have a guest economist to help make it a little easier and to make it, we're a little more relevant to today's topics. We try to mix it up with what's going on today. If you're interested in Austrian economics, you're going to have a lifetime's worth of reading. You can have as little or as much as you want at Mises.org.
Well, Jeff, thanks for your time today. Great stuff.
Yeah, great conversation.